Merler, TP Solutions Senior Risk Advisor. Ben, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jill. Good morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've been doing a series of webinars, and we plan on continuing that. And I don't think I need much of an introduction, but a lot of what I do here at TP Solutions is focused on vulnerability management, risk assessments, etc. So I think the topic we're talking about today on vulnerability testing and management is probably of great interest to the audience. And I really believe in it. It's not only what I do with a lot of my time here, but I also just think it's a vitally important exercise that really anybody who is protecting sensitive data should have to think about. There we go. Bear with me one sec. I'm just adjusting the thing. Okay, so first we'll talk about why this is so important, why you need to do this. And I imagine if you're on the line, you already have some urgency, but we'll get into this in a little more detail. There we go. So software and hardware is inherently flawed, and you can just ask Intel about this. When this isn't like a car, and even cars, of course, have defects that when they come off the lot, but when these products are released, any kind of application that you download, whether it's to your personal laptop, a desktop PC, an iPad, an Android phone, whatever, these things are living beings, kind of, and they're always getting software updates, including most of the time security updates. When these things are designed, they do not have all of the security concerns in mind when they release them, or really more accurately, they just don't know what they don't know yet. So we have to have some vulnerability management. The bad guys really go after those flaws. So they're looking for the doors that are left unlocked so that they can install malware or ransomware, commit some kind of fraud, so on and so forth. They're really trying to take advantage of the holes that were left open. These vendors, technology vendors of all kinds, not just software vendors, but hardware vendors as well, release fixes pretty regularly. I mean, you may have heard of them as patches, updates I've heard of. You may have heard of the term like a firmware update, or perhaps a security patch. These are all kind of interchangeable. But the point is that these patches are always coming out. And when I run vulnerability tests, and those patches are not managed, you really get a sense of the volume of vulnerabilities out there that these vendors have to deal with, especially contrasted with someone who does get those patches and updates. So vulnerability management, to me, is an ongoing process and requires discipline. So it's not just to say we're going to run a test and we're going to get all sorts of data from that test and we're going to fix it and then we're going to forget about it. Really, we should have an ongoing process. So we're going to get into a little bit today, but we want to test for vulnerabilities, see what's out there, take some analysis to it, initiate some recommendations, fix those issues, and then eventually go back and do some more testing, because the fact is that these things change over time. A PC that's considered safe today may not be safe tomorrow. The Intel issue that we're going to talk a little bit about later is a great example of this. It took Intel years to realize that the Meltdown and Spectre flaws even were a thing. So here's the basic agenda. We're going to talk about how to identify vulnerabilities through vulnerability testing, sort of, tell you how the sausage is made, so to speak. How those test results from these scans can be interpreted, because data is one thing, but it really it's not just about getting that data, but how it applies. How and if you can fix all these vulnerabilities identified, how we typically go about those issues, and different approaches and strategies for that. What kind of risk levels are acceptable? So that's a really difficult question, and that's more of a business type question than necessarily a technology question. When we're talking about risk management and vulnerability management, I think we have to accept the fact that there is no risk environments out there, that everyone's going to have flaws, that nothing is perfect. And even if I went through a system and fixed everything up and got all the scans to 0 flaws, 0 fails, whatever, there are things that are flaws that the scan doesn't know about. And again, just looking at that Intel issue is a great example. So what our goal is to say, well, what is our baseline? What is the goal we're looking to achieve, and how can we get there? The ongoing management and discipline of vulnerability management. How do we handle this? What kind of program do we put together so that, much like how we do our taxes or how we renew our health insurance or whatever we do, that this is part of what we do as an organization, that it's just another exercise, and that it's not a dramatic thing to do vulnerability testing and management. It's just a part of what we do, and nothing to get too worried about because it's something we control. I decided to put a little carve out specifically on Meltdown and Spectre. I don't know of the people on the line who's really interested in this, but obviously this is big news. Came out a couple weeks ago about this flaw with Intel processors. This is a hardware flaw with a software solution. So we're going to talk a little bit about that probably towards the second half of the webinar today, and how all these ideas vary in application. What we do for one organization varies to another, and we have to keep all of that in mind. And then any other considerations, and of course questions and things like that. So vulnerability testing, how does it work? And obviously we're not going to get into the bits and bytes of it, but I want you to understand how my process typically goes when I'm doing vulnerability testing. So to start, we need to scan. There are a variety of tools out there. Many different software vendors are out there. Really, the tool itself is not particularly special or unique. It's really how you use it that matters, how it's deployed that matters, so on and so forth. But scans are run to identify issues on a device, whether that's, and I would consider that an internal scan. So when I run a scan on my desktop PC, I consider that an internal vulnerability scan. Or the site itself, external. So think about your office, and in your office you most likely have, I'm hoping, a internet connection and a hardware firewall, preferably, probably some other stuff on your perimeter. Basically, this is the point of entry digitally into your office, and so we want to run a scan on that piece too. It's not just what happens when someone gets into your PC, but what if they get within your network? What if they join themselves and are now a part of your network, much like any other PC? We really want to know about those sorts of flaws as well. So then we check these scans. So the scan runs, and to be honest, the scan process is a little dull, right? It runs, it's looking against this database, and it may take, I tell people some scans take 5 minutes, some take several hours. Last week I was performing a vulnerability test on a client, and we had a desktop PC that took 24 hours to scan. Now, granted, this didn't interfere with anything. It's a passive process that doesn't really require any processing power. But it does take a little while. When that scan's done, I go to a portal and I am able to look at the data. And that's basically checking all the results from the scan against the list of known vulnerabilities. These vulnerabilities are scored and identified based on their impact and severity. And this is just very technical data that I use when I'm going through these reports. So we're also looking at a count, right? So it's not just what's vulnerable and what we find, but a relative count. If I'm looking at a device and the number of vulnerabilities are in the single digits or maybe the low double digits or something like that, I'm not particularly flummoxed. I look at that and I say, well, there's some things that need to be addressed. When you consider it a numbers game, as I do, you look at the big picture here. When you run a scan and you see a device that has 800 high severity vulnerabilities, and you see 2 high severity vulnerabilities on a single PC, obviously you interpret that data a lot differently, and you take a totally different approach. So the count really does matter. As I mentioned, those scores are there are scores on these vulnerabilities. So let's say I had 2 devices that each had 10 vulnerabilities identified on them. I'm going to take those issues differently based on the score. NIST issues something called the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, that basically scores on a level of 1 to 10 how these vulnerabilities should be considered. And obviously, if something's a 10 out of 10, we really want to address that. If something's a 1 out of 10, a lot of times it's actually not addressable, or it's an informational thing, or it's not sure it's a flaw or something like that. So scores really do matter for these vulnerabilities as well. We could keep that in mind. And then finally, report. So we're trying to, I look at the reports both individually on a device by device or location basis in the case of external scans, but I'm also running global reports because I want to see trends and analysis. So if the same flaw is showing up on every device on the network, and that device has, and that network, that system has a patch management and support plan in place, well, obviously we have a little bit of a hole in our solution, in our management. Maybe that patch just failed. Maybe there's a problem with the deployment process, or it's getting interrupted, or something like that. That's more of a global issue. Whereas I was running a scan last week for another client, and we saw that everything was getting taken care of except one device was really missing a lot of Microsoft scans. And that suggested to me that something was interrupting that device from getting those scans, getting those patches and updates. And as such, we needed to take a unique approach to that device. Not only that, we're required in a lot of instances, if it's a compliance-based assessment, beg your pardon, I'm getting over a little bit of a cold. We are required a lot of times to provide some hard data to verify that when we write a report saying that we think that things are relatively okay, or that we need to take some basic remediation steps, that we have some hard data justifying this, that we're not just making it up. Not only that, I sometimes get questions like, well, Ben, how do we know to trust you? How do we know that you're not going to just hide things that are flattering? Well, the data's right there. I don't run the scan myself. It's not like it's my data. This is data that's run externally that I'm collecting and looking at, and it's completely transparent. You can take a look at the data at any time. I have nothing to hide here. So the reports really help with that. One thing I want to note here at the bottom, you might be able to see, very seldom do we see completely clean vulnerability tests. And by very seldom, I would say in my experience running vulnerability tests for whole environments, I would say I have never seen a clean vulnerability test. This is not to say that these environments are poorly managed or poorly maintained, or the patch management doesn't work or whatever. But again, it's a numbers game. Thousands and thousands of security flaws on each device, multiplied by an entire network that's operated by people who make mistakes, that have other external things that can interrupt these processes, like power outages or internet connection failures or other stuff. And the truth is, something's not going to work right. Not only that, I have a lot of faith in our patch management product. It's very good. It's very effective. I see that in the data. But the patch management products sometimes have issues as well, so that they don't apply specific patch well or whatever. These are all sort of 99.9% things that we just have to keep in mind. Remember, the goal is not to have an environment without risk. We're always going to have risk. The goal is to keep that risk level at a low, acceptable level that we agree upon. We're going to pivot a little bit towards interpretation. So when I want to figure out the meaning of the results, all those reports I'm looking at, I'm looking for a few things. So first are the actual devices with flaws. There's a difference between a laptop that is used to browse the web only, and one of the managers uses it to watch YouTube videos when he's traveling, versus a server. And that server is a database that controls medical records, that require backup and compliance and all this other stuff. Obviously I'm going to take those results differently. Just to make it apples to apples, let's say that the PC that really doesn't do anything has 10 high severity vulnerabilities, and so does that server. Well, I'm going to address that server first, because the server is where this valuable asset is located. That's where the data is located. That PC might not even talk to the server. They may, if something happens to that PC, what do we lose? Maybe the PC goes down, we have to replace the PC. Well, in the big scheme of things, replacing a PC and having a significant data breach are two dramatically different consequences. So we need to keep that in mind when looking at the devices with flaws. We also want to look at the actual data assets located on those devices and the value assigned to them. Some of that has to be defined, of course, by the client. So every machine, most machines have hard drives on them, and they have data stored on them. If that data is a bunch of cat pictures that I found on the internet that are really funny, and that data is then hacked and stolen by a hacker, well, I'm not going to lose a lot of sleep over the hacker taking my cat pictures. But if it is a server, again, with that sensitive data that we care about, that we could be held liable for, maybe there's fines, regulations, punishments, etc., I'm going to take that a whole lot more seriously. So data assets really do matter. And I think when you're talking any kind of risk management profile, whether we're talking about vulnerability testing or configuration analysis or what kind of backup we install or a disaster recovery solution or monitoring or even the level of support we give on a day-to-day basis as an IT support company, a lot of it matters about, a lot of it comes back to what we're doing with the technology. How do we value the technology? What does it do for us? And what kind of value it has? Again, as I mentioned before, we're looking at the severity of the flaw and the likelihood of the impact. So those are two different things, right? One is the severity of the flaw. How much could I damage a machine with this flaw? How much of a wreck can I create? And then there's also the likelihood of that. So this is very damaging. You know, it's very damaging if my server, you know, just to make it a little bit less abstract, let's say the server room catches on fire. Well, that's obviously very, very damaging. We don't want the server room to catch on fire. That's a big problem for us. But the likelihood of a server room catching on fire for most people is pretty low. I mean, we're not, oftentimes these rooms are protected. Sometimes they have sprinklers, whatever. And just the fact is that it's not like fires happen every day. These are more rare occurrences. It's obviously much more likely, to be perfectly blunt, that you experience a cyber attack than experience an entire fire in your office. So we have to consider that kind of likelihood when talking about remediation strategies. And I alluded to this in the previous slide, but whether the flaw is limited to a specific device or across multiple nodes, this is about really how vulnerabilities are being managed currently and what kind of tweaks we need to make to our strategy. And lastly, and this is very important for compliance purposes, for design purposes, for strategic purposes, all sorts of reasons, we want to know whether these flaws are actually addressable through conventional means. There are times where I've done scans, including for compliance reasons, and we do everything we can do. All the device has been updated to the best of our satisfaction, or everything we have the technical capabilities of doing. And yet, if we fix this one particular flaw, well, then our connection with this other database breaks or something like that. You know, at some point you have to say, well, we have to kind of live with this, you know. This is not always the case. I mean, most issues that we find we are able to fix. Beg your pardon again. But there are times where things simply cannot be addressed for whatever reason. The other side of vulnerability management is how we fix and prevent these flaws in the first place. Yes, testing is very important. I would recommend for any organization that has data or security that they care about to have some kind of vulnerability testing program or strategy or something, even if it's just to do it one time and then think about what we're going to do in the future later. I think everybody should really do some kind of testing. You know, basically, very important on a day-to-day basis is how are we preventing this? You know, yeah, we're going to run this test, but we need to make sure this is ongoing. The test is good today and the fixes are good today, but what about a month from now when we find something new? How do we fix and prevent these things in the first place? So, as I mentioned before, the highest severity vulnerabilities, the things that really could have significant impact, must be patched across the board to the very best effort possible. These are extremely important things. You may consider the fact that there are many high severity vulnerabilities on end of life products from certain vendors, you know, Windows XP, for example, that will never get addressed. And so when we go to clients and we say, well, it's time for this device to be replaced, it's hit end of life, you know, we can't do anything, and now it's a risky device, that really does mean something, because if that device is end of life and it's getting a vulnerability that we can't fix, you're basically a sitting duck for a cyber attack. As I was bringing forth before, you know, regardless of vulnerability testing, if you have concerns about security issues in general, and this is a really low bar, frankly, in terms of IT support, everyone in their environment should have a patch management strategy and process. You should know on every device that you have on your system that accesses data that your organization cares about, you should know how that device is getting patched and vulnerabilities are being managed. This includes PCs that people take and work from home with, some laptop that's in the office and I'm taking it home with me. You have to have a strategy for that device because even though it's not in your office, the data breach that happens on that device, your organization could be responsible for. So we need to consider every device that accesses data that we care about a part of our patch management strategy. And if there are people on the line right now who are working with us and they have some home PC that they don't really pay attention to, but they do a lot of work on, maybe we need to have a discussion about how that device needs to get a little bit more management so that we can be sure that those remote workers are getting the support they need. Regular vulnerability testing is necessary to identify the new flaws, so things that we didn't know about before, the effectiveness of the current patch management strategy, and deal with issues that will inevitably occur, things that just don't work right. Other things to keep in mind is that when we make configuration changes to systems, when you're talking a system, maybe perhaps two applications on two different servers didn't share data before, but now they do. There's some connector built between them or something like that. There's a decent chance that when we run vulnerability testing in the future, we'll find that this created some kind of flaw, maybe a SSL certificate flaw, or maybe maybe just a general port issue or whatever. It doesn't really matter. The point is that when the system changes, so do the vulnerabilities out there. So when your system goes through the evolutions that it will inevitably have, people get new machines, the servers are replaced, you move from an in-house solution to a cloud-based hosting solution or some kind of hybrid solution, or you've doubled your space, or you've added a new office, or you've moved your office. All those other sort of baselines, landmarks, events, whatever. This is when it's worth considering your vulnerability management strategy, because now something has changed to impact what vulnerabilities you might have. And we also want to close doors that don't need to exist in the first place. A lot of devices come out of the box with open doors that they probably shouldn't have. Some doors have been opened for something in the past and they were never closed. Oh, well, before we had a terminal server and we used this terminal server to remote in, and then we got rid of that terminal server, but we never actually closed the port for that terminal server. That stuff happens quite a bit in my experience when I run tests, and so we want to make sure that's addressed. So what is acceptable when it comes to vulnerabilities? How far do we have to take this? As I mentioned, the high severity stuff really has to be addressed. Even the basic devices, laptops, even the example I gave of the manager who has just likes to watch YouTube on his laptop, I just don't want to have any high severity vulnerabilities on that device. I just think it's not necessary. Most of what's the sort of silver lining to a lot of high severity vulnerabilities is that they are very addressable. It's the simple fact that they were addressed as high severity means that the vendors are aware of them and have issued fixes for them most of the time. So it really, to me, seems like an obvious choice to address first. And then the lower severity, obviously, we're much more flexible on. The bottom line, and the way I would consider it and the way I'd encourage you and your staff to consider it, is any place where you have high value data assets, those need to be the least vulnerable. Your server, beg your pardon, I'm sorry for the coughing. Your servers that have, that basically are like data vaults that contain the equivalent of digital cache, if you want to think of it that way, really need to be the least vulnerable. They need to be the toughest things to get into. They should have very few rights for people to access. Those rights should be very limited. The vulnerabilities on them should be quite limited. They should be if they aren't necessary to be seen from a remote location, some sort of remote access, they shouldn't be. That sort of thing. So an ongoing management strategy, and we're going to try and create sort of a little loop here. We have patch management in place. We put this in place so that we can really clean things up. When we onboard a client onto Confidence Plus, which is our managed services agreement, where we provide, we're your IT department, so to speak. one of the first things we do is deploy patch management and run a wave of patches because, to be perfectly blunt, a lot of times when we take over clients' IT support, we find that things aren't exactly in the shape that we'd like them to be. So we run a wave of patches. As a matter of fact, I have an upcoming vulnerability test I have to work on for a new client, but we are waiting until the patch management's run because the truth is what's going to happen, my full expectation if I ran the scans now, is that we'd run the scans, we'd see there's a whole bunch of problems, and then we'd install the patch management tools and deploy them, and then they all go away, and then we have maybe a few things to fix. Well, we already know we're going to have to run the tool. Let's run the tool and then run the scans that fix the the rough edges afterwards. Then we come up with a regular testing strategy on all devices. So again, any device that has access to organization data that we care about really has to be a part of the test. We have a strategy for that. It's very important also that the clients be involved in this process. We as an IT company, we're very knowledgeable on the technology, but we really need our clients to illustrate to us how they use that technology, how it matters, et cetera. We're really good with bits and bytes, but it's important in the end that a message is illustrated to us about why this stuff matters, so that we can give you the right technology solutions, we can address it in the right way. But really, I would say that even in some of the slightly more casual environments where the data is important, but maybe we don't have any compliance, I think a perhaps yearly vulnerability test is not a bad idea. PCI dictates that vulnerability testing, which is the payment card industry, dictates that vulnerability testing be done quarterly. I just think having a regular strategy where we're doing our checkups just like we would if we were going to visit a doctor for our own personal health, we have to have a testing plan and discipline in place. It's really, really, really important that end users, that the clients internally keep their own device inventories. Yes, DPS for our clients keeps inventories on stuff, and we have, as one of the nice things about our patch management tools is that it does give us a little bit of an inventory. But again, sometimes people bring in their new cell phone and they replace their other cell phone and nobody really makes note of it, or 10 laptops get replaced and we don't really keep a document internally about our inventory. I see it all the time. Very large organizations not keeping local inventories, assuming someone else does it. Well, at the end of the day, I think that everybody needs to have, even again, it's not that we don't do it. I just think that as an end user, you have to have some ownership of your equipment and keep that inventory in place just in case something happens, in case DPS goes away, in case a new device comes in, we have to address it, or we find some issue. We want to know what devices are in place. One other thing to consider with device inventories is that if we're ever doing some kind of monitoring or analysis, or perhaps we have to bring in a forensics company to look into what happened with a hack, it's good to know what PCs are supposed to be connected to our system and are supposed to be getting this information, so that if we see something unusual, we could say, well, that's not in our list. This was a foreign person, and foreign in the, not within our environment, who is accessing our data, and we know this because they're not in our inventory, and we need to address it. Sometimes after the testing, we'll recommend additional security tools. A good example of this is disk encryption. I see a device, and that device, a server hopefully, has thousands and thousands of social security numbers on it because we're a tax firm that does this sort of work. If we're having a server that hosts all of this data, and let's say for the sake of argument that drive can be pulled out and stolen, and then that data be read, it's really important that we deploy an encryption tool on that server so that the data that we identified on that box is encrypted at rest. That's just one example of a security tool we might use. We might recommend event monitoring, where suspicious events are tracked and responded to, and trend analysis is performed. Or perhaps we need to deploy web filtering or other tools that support the vulnerability management process. A lot of times doing vulnerability testing will make clear the need for these tools. And last, but definitely not least, and perhaps one of, if not the most important part of ongoing management, I believe, is user awareness and responsible computing. As I said, we are always going to have flaws on systems. Systems are inherently flawed, and even well-done maintenance is always going to have issues. Another analogy I give people is that you can get a flu shot and still get the flu. And so it's really, but what you do as a person, even though you got that flu shot, is that when somebody's coughing in their office like I am right now, you don't go around and shake hands and drink out of their glass and stuff like that. You act responsibly. You don't take it for granted that you did the right things. You don't take it for granted that you're living a healthy lifestyle. You act responsibly anyway. So I think sometimes people think, well, I did vulnerability testing, I have antivirus in place, I have a firewall, encryption, all this great stuff, and now, well, I'm not really worried about going to this website or opening this email or doing whatever. It still matters what end users do. Not just that, a lot of these attacks are not necessarily looking at flaws, vulnerabilities. Sometimes they're looking to exploit you, get you to volunteer information, as is the case in phishing schemes. And so it really is important that users get some kind of awareness training and have a sense and an obligation and a duty and a responsibility to be good with their computers. I always say having a staff of skeptical people who don't take things for granted that they come into their email, or don't take for granted the attachments that they're opening or the sites they're going to, really does create a significant risk reduction at the end of the day. Beg your pardon. We're just going to pivot a little bit. I wanted to carve out a little bit about I'm sorry, about Meltdown and Spectre, and just sort of give a special note about what these things are and what they mean, because obviously it's very technical and we want to give just a little bit of basic information. The first thing I'll say about this is that for our clients who we provide patch management and support to, these flaws have been addressed. We took the initiative, as we do with all high severity vulnerabilities and such, with our patch management tool, to deal with this as it comes in so that it doesn't sit out there. And so again, I encourage you, if you're not currently doing anything for vulnerability management, anything for patch management, this is really something that I think you need to add to your agenda as an organization, because it's kind of a ticking time bomb. So what are Meltdown and Spectre? The first thing to keep in mind is that this is a hardware problem. These are problems inherent with chips that are built on motherboards. It's really important to keep that in mind, right? When you have a piece of software, software can be manipulated and changed. You can change lines of code. It's not like you can easily just go into a computer and rewire a processor. It's not a trivial thing. These microprocessors have tons of transistors in them. So this is a hardware problem with a software solution until the next generation of Intel chips comes out. And I don't think it's necessarily unique to Intel, but the next generation of chips comes out that avoids this in the first place. The fix to these solutions is, by the way, a software solution. So we're creating new processes, new instructions for processors that weren't necessarily designed for this. And as such, there's probably going to be a small processor tax, if you will. A little bit of a performance hit. It's most likely very small when you apply these updates, but that does not mean that we don't run these updates. I think what it does mean, in terms of a general commentary, is that if you have a device with an older processor, perhaps it's 5 or 6 years old computer, old server, etc., your end of life just got a little bit sooner, a little bit quicker, because we've just added a little bit more work for that processor that already probably needed to get replaced in the beginning. So anyway, what's Meltdown? So Meltdown bypasses hardware rules in the CPU that normally prevents processes from reading data from other processes. Every instructions and processes that happen in the CPU are segmented and segregated, so that, for example, when you're putting in a password into one part and it's being held in one part of memory, that another part of memory to an unrelated part of what the computer's doing at any given time, because computers do so many things at once, is not reading that. Meltdown allows somebody to go around those hardware rules. Oh, you're a process for some sort of calculation. Well, now we're going to exploit that process to read a password that's encrypted and stored within the processor at the time. It's a very difficult explanation to make, but just keep in mind that it is breaking down barriers that normally prevent information that's secure within your processor and your RAM, and it's unsecuring them. Spectre is very similar. but it's speculative. So a lot of people don't know this, but processors, when they have extra overhead, do some sort of predictive analysis. They try to bring up information into memory that it thinks you're going to ask for. Because if it knows what piece of data it needs next, it doesn't have to seek that data out and then process it. That's very good, right? We're making the process for pulling data up and processing it very efficient, and we're really utilizing these processors. Oh, something just happened. Bear with me 1 second. I see. We just got a question. I'm sorry. They minimized my window for a moment. Anyway, what Spectre is it's focusing on that speculative execution. So it's reading data from processes your CPU thinks you might need in order to speed up processing. So your computer thinks you're going to need a piece of data from a specific part of memory, so it pulls it up, but you didn't actually need it. But now that process, because of Spectre, someone is seeing data that you didn't even necessarily ask for, but was stored within the memory of your machine. So that's what it does essentially. Bottom line though, I'm talking very technical about what these are. You need to get these issues fixed. I believe it involves fixes to the registry in Windows. This is not something that I recommend the average layperson do. You really should have a professional look at it. And again, we are addressing this for our clients. By the time this webinar is up, I believe we've already addressed it for our managed clients. But if you're not on that list, if you haven't really done this, I would strongly encourage you to get in touch with us and start looking into what we can do for patch management in general, but especially this. So a few other things to consider. We, again, always consider all the potential consequences of a security incident. Remember, a lot of people think about system failure. Oh, I can't get into my computer. But what about the liability for data that's breached? What if data is stolen? What are you liable for? Could you be fined? Could you be held criminally liable? Would you have to publicize this, as in the case of HIPAA with specific numbers of breaches? You have to go to the media and volunteer yourself as a hacked entity. How about just the downtime and loss of productivity? Well, it's not just that PC's down, but everyone's getting paid. You can't reach out to your clients. Maybe you're not closing sales or whatever. These things can be significant. There's obviously the ethics of this, if you care about that stuff, which is that when you take sensitive data, personal data, you really are holding someone's trust and privacy in your hands. And I think just like you wouldn't give away your family's personal information or a friend's personal information, I think as a business, you have an obligation to protect this information just for the sake of your clients, that you should want to protect this information, that it should matter to you. Because I think, frankly, if the shoe was on the other foot, and it is for everyone, of course, because we all share our data with somebody who has access to it, like people who do our taxes or investment brokers or doctors or what have you. We want them to protect it, so we really should take that approach with the data we control. It's just the right thing to do. You also have client trust. If your data is breached with a client that you have and you're responsible for it, I would imagine chances are they're not going to want to work with you in the future. I could probably come up with a very, very long list. And there are all sorts of consequences I haven't even considered, but you really need to keep that in mind. When you're talking about value of data and value of downtime and what the real risks are, you're basically totaling, you could put a dollar value on these if you wanted to and total up all the consequences. Some of these are abstract, obviously, but if you took all of these consequences and threw them in a big bucket together, that's really what your risk is. And unless you're considering it that way, if your focus is too narrow, then the risk management profile, and again, it doesn't just pertain to vulnerability testing and management, but really anything you do for security, you need to consider the total value of that risk in order to come up with an acceptable strategy moving forward. Here's a few risk management best practices. So again, security awareness training. I really recommend that end users, especially lay people who are just not they don't do what I do for a living or what other people within DPS do for a living. They need to have some basic security awareness and know what's out there so they can avoid those pratfalls. I strongly recommend, and this is something I see on vulnerability tests all the time, severely limiting the data storage and sprawl. Local desktops and laptops, things that are not really meant to be storage locations like a server or a network attached storage device or a cloud service or what have you. We want to keep those data in those vaults and not on PCs where it could be lost, breached, etc. It also makes the pardon me. It also makes the strategy for securing this data a lot more complicated. If, let's say, for the sake of argument, you have 25 desktop PCs and 4 servers, and the data is everywhere. Well, now we need to back up everything and encrypt everything and do all this other stuff. Wouldn't it be a lot easier if that data was all centrally located so that we can encrypt just those locations, back up just those locations, etc.? Make things a lot easier, a lot less expensive, and a lot more manageable. We want to develop strong policies to create a culture of compliance. Everyone in the organization should understand what data the organization cares about, why it matters, the consequences of a breach, the consequence not just to the company but to themselves. What's acceptable use? What do they do if there's a security incident? Those policies have to be in place. The configuration of the system. What rights do people have? So a machine that has a certain amount of vulnerabilities and then the end user in control of that machine has way more rights than they should have, well, we've just amplified, inflated the risk more than it needs to be. So system configuration really matters. And same for user rights management, sort of goes along with system configuration. I want everyone to remember we're talking about vulnerability management today, which is a very technical thing, and it's vitally important, but it's just one part of security and risk management. There are many tools out there that need to be considered. So my recommended next steps is really, if you haven't already done so, I always recommend a risk consultation. You can go to the link here, and we can just have a chat about it. It really helps me when I'm working with our clients to just understand who you are. It really has to be the first step. I often get very random requests from people that we don't work with, and they say, well, what do I need to do for vulnerabilities? What does a risk assessment cost? Just these very general questions. And yeah, I mean, I can answer that broadly. And of course, if you give me a few pieces of basic information, how many PCs you have, where the servers are located, etc., we can do that. But I don't really feel like I'm giving you the right answer. The right answer is, let's talk about why we're doing this. Let's talk about what your goals are. Let's talk about what risk levels are acceptable and where your stuff is and what kind of organization you are and how the data flows within your environment. Then we can come up with a solution that fits what you do and that we're not overreaching or underreaching with our strategy when it comes to cybersecurity risk. We really want to have that consultation first so that whatever we do, it makes sense. And if anyone ever comes to us in the future and says, hey, you had this breach, or we want to know, you're getting audited, we want to know what you're doing, we want to be able to go to somebody and say, yeah, we really thought this out. We took a managed, specific approach to this. We really broke it down, understood where our risks were, why we were taking this approach, how far we could go. And by the way, if we decided not to do something, this is why we decided not to do it. It's just too expensive. We couldn't justify it in the budget. Whatever it is, at least we've come up with thoughtfulness and due diligence, which a lot of organizations do not do. And now I'm going to pivot and we'll just do a little questions and answers. I saw that there was one question here about materials for a materials package for slides. If anyone wants them, we have PDF copies that we can give you after the event is over. But
yes, I will
Jill,
be emailing I'll be emailing a copy of the webinar recording, as well as if you would like a PDF, just let me know. Yes, if you have any questions, just type them into the question panel and we'll go ahead and answer them. Looks like we do have one come in. Okay, what kind of interruption or downtime will vulnerability testing bring to my organization?
Typically little to none. I have a few strategies for deploying vulnerability scans. To be clear, on external scans, I do them remotely, and they have never created any problems whatsoever. You won't even notice they're happening. That's something that you don't have to worry about at all. Internally, when I'm trying to look at devices, servers, PCs, the only interruption that would happen, and only sometimes, is when we have to do manual scans on PCs. In general, and anyone who's worked with me before on this can attest to this. If I have to run a scan manually, usually what I have to do is put it on a USB stick or download it from a site or something like that, and then run it locally on the PC, which is really only a few minutes. I double click the scanner, which has been configured in advance. It runs in the background, and that's it. So yeah, I'm interrupting the person for 3 or 4 minutes. Typically not the end of the world. So no, it's not a major downtime thing. It's not like we have to say, well, we need a week to do this or even a whole day to do this. I might stop by your office for an hour or two if I have to run it manually. Other times, if we're doing it, sometimes we can run it through the server during off hours through some kind of more managed deployment. The type of message I'll give is, hey, I'd like to run this scan Wednesday at 8 p.m. Can you make sure at the end of the day that your PCs are powered on but locked? And we're going to deploy this at this time, and it's going to run overnight, and it'll be done in the morning. And then there is really no interruption at all, except the interruption of you leaving your computer locked at night. So yeah, not a really big deal, and no one's really complained ever.
Great. Okay, we had another question come in. You mentioned systems having ports that are left opened. How can we determine which are opened and not used, and how do we close them?
You run a scan and you find out. There's a couple ways to do this. One is you literally look in the configs and see all the information as needed, and that could be manually. Really, though, this is when vulnerability testing is important, because vulnerability testing is not just looking at what ports are open, but how exposed those ports are to flaws. Ports are going to be open. Ports are supposed to be open. If you want to go on the web and browse, you got to open up a hole for that, right? You got to be able to get out. If you want to send an email, you have to be able to send that email. So, much like a literal a nautical port or an airport, there are ways to get into it. It's just a matter of what should be opened and not, and really that's for testing.
All right, thank you. We have another question. How often do I need to do vulnerability tests?
That's a unique question to everyone. There are a few answers to this. One is, if you have a compliance standard, sometimes the compliance standard will dictate what you have to do. As I mentioned, PCI, payment card industry, if you're dealing with a lot of credit cards, especially storing cards, which, side note, I really don't recommend you store cards at rest if you could avoid it at all, because it really makes the matter a lot more complicated. But at any rate, PCI dictates quarterly vulnerability scans internally for certain levels, I think. And but if you just generally care, I usually recommend annually. Sometimes we'll change that based on results. Sometimes we don't exactly know what's right. If I was dealing with a organization for the first time ever, and I ran a series of vulnerability tests, and those vulnerability tests came back with really troubling results across the board, and it was going to take a major effort to remediate those issues, not just a few fixes here and there, but like a totally different change in strategy. Maybe they have no patch management whatsoever, etc. I might be a little more aggressive, and I might say, well, we scanned this and things are really bad, so we really need to do a rescan in like 2 months. That might be just sort of a one-off, where we take that approach. Other times I'll just say, see you again next year. But again, like anything else, this is why the consultation is important. We have these discussions up front about what you're doing, why you're doing it, and how we can approach managing into the future. And really, we can strategize this together.
Great, thanks. Okay, we have one more question. How accurate are the vulnerability tests?
Mostly. The vulnerability tests do have false positives. Sometimes they come up with issues that you can't resolve, which is not necessarily an accuracy issue, but a plausibility issue. But but it's not unheard of that sometimes it reports false positives. It's not going to, if a vulnerability has been identified and scored by NIST CVSS, then it should show up in the scan assuming the scan is not broken or something like that. But the scans, if they break, they automatically fail and we have to rescan, so that's not really a concern. The biggest concern I would have is false positives. But then again, we're not so worried about false positives. I'd rather find something and find out it's not a big deal than not find out something at all. You know, we want those kinds of errors. But it's not unheard of that something shows up on a scan, I investigate it, and it's like, well, this doesn't actually exist here, and here's why it showed up on the scan. PCI, for example, for some of their external scanners, gives you an opportunity to report those false positives and say, hey, listen, you know, it's coming up on the scan, but we did everything we could, and sorry, it's not fixable. You just have to prove that, stuff like that.
Okay, I don't see any more questions coming in, so I think with that we can go ahead and wrap up. Again, I will be sending out a recording of today's webinar after this, and if you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to your DPS account rep or to Ben directly. Ben, did you have any closing words?
Yeah, I just wanted to say thanks for tuning in today. I hope it was helpful. Our goal is really to do regular webinars on a variety of different topics and really have a lot of engagement for people working with us, because we feel like it's important that you know, everybody have some knowledge that we're continually growing, not just ourselves but our clients, and get you some understanding. Feel free to send me an email or give me a call if you got any questions. And you know, interacting with you guys is the best part of my work. So thanks.
Okay, thanks everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day.